Okay, I'd like to welcome you all to this Shevchenko Scientific Society webinar. It's entitled Russian Energy Chains, the Remaking of Technopolitics from Siberia to Ukraine to the European Union. Our featured speaker today will be Dr. Margarita Balmaceda, who is the author of Russian Energy Chains, a new book that's come out with Columbia University Press that traces Russian hydrocarbons on their way to Europe through Ukraine from Siberia. And we're very pleased that we can organize this and that we could have a distinguished panel of respondents. And of course, I'd like to thank you all for being here, the presenters and the audiences alike. And I'd like to introduce our speakers briefly, and then I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Balmaceda. So Margarita Balmaceda is Professor of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University. Concurrently, she is an associate at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute and heads the study group on energy materiality, infrastructure, spatiality, and power at the Hanse Wissenschaftskolleg in Germany, with support, among others, of Marie Skłodowska-Curie Fellowship from the European Commission, a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, and 3 Fulbright Fellowships. She has conducted extensive research in Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, Lithuania, Moldova, Hungary, Germany, and Finland. Her education includes a PhD in politics from Princeton University, as well as postdoctoral training at Harvard University and ongoing training on metallurgical technology through courses at the World Steel University. Dr. Balmaceda is also a member of the Shevchenko Scientific Society and serves as a member of the board. Our commentators today include Dr. Andrian Prokip, who is the director of the energy program at the Ukrainian Institute of the Future, Ukrainsky Institut Майбутнього in Kyiv, and senior associate at the Kennan Institute in Washington, D.C., where he was also a Fulbright Kennan Institute research scholar in 2015 and 2016, and is a frequent contributor to its publication series. We're also joined by Mr. Oleg Savitsky, who is a climate and energy policy expert at the Ukrainian Climate Network, board member of the NGO Eco Action, Ecodia, in Kyiv, and a former fellow of the Suko Foundation in Greifswald, Germany. His main focus is the coal industry, decarbonization of the power sector and heavy industry, as well as reduction of air pollution. And we're also joined by Professor Guido Hausmann, who is the head of the history division at the Leibniz Institute for East and Southeast European Studies and professor of history of Southeast and Eastern Europe at the University of Regensburg. Among other fellowships, he was a Huri visiting fellow in 2003. And last but not least, we were joined as well by Professor Steven Siegel, who is a historian of geography and cartography in Ukraine and its neighboring countries, and is professor of Slavic and Eurasian studies at the University of Texas at Austin. He is also the host of 3 channels at the New Books Network podcast series and a former director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute's summer program. And we're also pleased to note that Professor Siegel is a member of the Shevchenko Scientific Society. I will now turn the floor over to Margarita, who will tell us a bit about her book, and then we'll also, I'm sure, have time in the Q&A for questions about the current relevance of the energy sector to Ukraine's war. So I would like to turn the floor over. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to be able to share this important topic with my dear colleagues at the Shevchenko Society that has so much contributed not only to my own work, but to understanding of Ukraine, especially in this very difficult moment. And in particular, I am just tremendously pleased to be able to have my wonderful colleagues, Oleg Savitsky, Andrian Prokip, Guido Hausmann, and Steven Siegel as part of this conversation. It is very touching to be able to share with them, very enriching. And in particular, I am very, very thankful to Oleg Savitsky and Andrian Prokip for taking the trouble of joining us from the Ukraine. We know how difficult the situation is there, and we want your voice to be heard and your perspective on this and many, many other issues. So I would like to take maybe 20, 25 minutes to give you a little bit of an overview of this book. It's probably going to be only a very general statement. This is a book that I worked on for 7 years. It has many different levels. It is intended to foster and to provoke a number of conversations, including many perhaps very unpleasant and uncomfortable conversations. It's also intended to give readers the technical tools to be able to lead those conversations in a deeper manner than the way we have until now. And therefore, whatever I will say in the next 20 minutes will only be skimming the surface. I encourage you to look for this book in your library, or to read the first chapter, which is available free of cost, or if you want to purchase it with the 20% discount that is available to us. But let me first try to share my screen and put this work in the context of some larger questions I have been working on. So just bear with me for a moment. Second. Very good. So what I would like before talking specifically about this book is to give you a very brief background on my work on the topic. It's hard to believe it, but I have been working on Ukrainian and post-Soviet energy for more than 20 years. Maybe it was a little bit too much, but what has this work been and what has prompted it? So basically, when I started working on this topic, everybody was discussing or talking about the Russian energy weapon. And I was always challenged by the fact that there was something that didn't really fit here. There was something that didn't work really well when this phrase was used in the way it was used at that point, because very often it was used to refer to energy as an undifferentiated whole without thinking about the differences between different energy types. It did not really talk about technology seriously. And at that time, it really bothered me that it didn't treat energy dependent states or energy consumer states as real actors. It kind of treated them only as recipients of Russian policy. So starting with my year as a postdoctoral fellow at HURI in 1996, I started to look at these issues and ended up writing several books looking at different aspects of this issue. And basically the key point in that work is that I try to look at the black box in the energy dependent states, and in particular in Ukraine. So looking at Ukraine not simply as recipient of Russian energy policies, but as an actor. I looked at winners and losers of different ways of organizing energy policy. I looked at issues of governance and corruption, what happens when some groups hijack energy policy. So my first book in this series was a book totally devoted to energy corruption in Ukraine. Everything you want to know about energy corruption in Ukraine between 1991 and 2006 is there. It was very detailed research, part of it done in Ukraine. A second book, which was also the recipient of a small publication subsidy by NTSHA, for which I'm very grateful, is a comparison of energy policies between Ukraine, Lithuania, and Belarus, whereby if I started with the idea of trying to understand how different political systems in those countries affected the way they dealt with energy relations with Russia, actually, what I found out is that the way those energy relationships were dealt with actually fed back and affected the political system. I also wrote a separate book on the role of energy, and in particular, the role of oil refining profits in propping the Lukashenko regime in Belarus. This is obviously not a book about Ukraine, but it's actually very important for Ukraine because Ukraine today imports most of its gasoline and diesel from Belarus, and obviously Belarus is participating in the Russian attack on Ukraine. So even when I worked on all these black boxes, even when I understood that corruption and hijacking of energy policy was an issue, even when I understood that there was an ambiguous ambiguous attitude in key oligarchic actors vis-a-vis energy relations with Russia, still, even with that work, I failed to understand that the issue of energy pressure by Russia, energy threat by Russia, was a little bit even more complex than I had unveiled in those books. Because even if you leave away the issue of corruption, you have to understand that that energy relationship, that participation in those Russian energy chains, as I call them in this book, had a very strong element of temptation and a very strong element of profitability. And this was not only the profits which corrupt actors could accrue. Now, I wrote an entire book about energy corruption. I can certainly tell you a lot about what corrupt actors got from this relationship. But the point is that participation in those energy chains, in those export chains of Russian energy, actually produced a number of benefits, if you wish, temptations to a number of actors. It allowed countries like Ukraine to retain a certain leverage vis-a-vis their larger supplier. Economists often talked about this as the bilateral monopoly in terms, at least, of natural gas transit. It allowed key actors to participate in those profitable value-added chains, not only through corruption, but also through transit fees. It allowed a particular load of the technological system, and we'll talk more about that later, that allowed the system to work. And it also gave a country like Ukraine implied security guarantees through its transit role, in contrast with the formal security guarantees it had received through the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, for example, which did not really seem to play a role. So this idea of the balance or tension between threat and temptation has been really key in my work on this topic. And what I try to do in this book is to look at how that opportunity, threat, and temptation works out, but for a variety of actors in that relationship. To do that, I really pay attention to the idea of looking at the entire value chain, not just supply. This is a really key concept in this book, but it's also so important today. When we look at sanctions concerning Russia, and when we look at the way Western energy companies are supposedly divesting from Russia, it's so important that we just don't look simply at supply, that we look at the entire value chain, because there is where you see the devil in the details. And in this book, I do that. Sometimes here we refer to these as supply chains. That is correct. Supply chains refer mainly to the physical supply. That is perfectly fine. I prefer to use the term value chains because I am adding to the sheer supply the element of valuation, of pricing, which anybody working on oil knows how important that is and how it can destroy entire value or not. And that is very key. So a key element in this book is looking at the entire value chain. And what I do, and this is a very basic scheme, is I am looking at the entire value chain from the upstream, the production, to the midstream, to the downstream. Midstream, we often think of it in terms of transit, but it can also be refining. It can also be transformation into other goods, as we saw in the case of coal. And in the downstream, we are talking about use by end users. In this book, I made a point of having my three goods start in Russia. They happen to start in Siberia because this is where those goods are produced, and all of them end in the European Union, and more specifically in Germany. I chose a concrete country, Germany, not three whatever points in the European Union, because even to this day, national level legislation is very important in terms of energy policies and national level interest groups. So it was important that my three chains end in the same country. Upstream, downstream, upstream, midstream, downstream. So The three chains that I follow in this book are the oil chain starting from Batyagansko in southwestern Siberia to a gas station and diesel sale in Dresden. My natural gas chain goes from Urengoy in northern western Siberia to the Franken 1 power station in Bavaria. And my coal value chain, which is the most interesting of all of them, has a very interesting detour because it goes through Mariupol, today sadly in the news, to Italy, to the Skanskip transmodal terminal in Duisburg, Germany. So these chains I have checked, I have followed, not necessarily physically, but in following them, I show the reader all the complex interactions that are playing a role in that relationship. And what are the central questions that I seek to pursue in this book? So the empirical question is, how has participation in those Russian energy export chains affected power relationships? And here I'm talking not only about the power of one state above another, but also about the power of domestic players. So for example, if we look at the case of coal, we see that this particular energy type, with all the industrial implications and uses, made possible the growth of really important political players in Ukraine with a variety of consequences. At the theoretical level, which was basically my original interest in pursuing this question, I wanted to see how do the distinct characteristics of different energy types affect power relations. So I was really sick and tired of the American narrative, which basically saw everything that happened in energy through the prism of oil. And I show in this book that the physical composition, the even molecular composition of different energy goods affects what you can do with it, because it affects what kind of technology you must use to extract value from it, and that will affect what you can do with it. So for example, in my natural gas chapter, the title of this chapter is Managing Pressure, because when you are talking about natural gas, it's essential to manage the level of pressure in the pipeline at different levels of the pipeline, and that will also affect what you can do with it. And at a historical level, I try to understand how did participation in Russian energy chains shape political life in post-Soviet societies, including Ukraine. I try to answer these questions, but I try to do that in a way that goes beyond a purely academic book. It's a very serious book. It's has been very thoroughly researched, and as I said, I spent 7 years writing it. But what I try to do is in a single package. Of course, it's not a small package, but it's still a single package, to deal with 3 energy types: natural gas, oil, and coal. To deal with 3 areas: Russia, Ukraine, the European Union. And I do that, or I seek to do that, through the travelogue of 3 molecules: a natural gas molecule, an oil molecule, and a coal molecule, in their travel from Siberia to Germany. So by engaging this travelogue, I try to reach a more general public who may be interested in that travelogue, perhaps not only or so much on the theoretical side of the issue. And as I said, it is my goal with this book to prompt difficult conversations, but also to empower the readers to have those conversations in a new way. And to do that, I bring in a lot of technology, but I also include a lot of information that will help the reader use the technology. For example, the book includes a glossary of technical terms and explanations that I believe will help in those conversations. So I hope that this book would also be accessible to a larger public and also to students. So very briefly, when we are talking about threat and temptation, and the tension between threat and temptation, let's remember that this is not only about Ukraine. We have seen that even in former Soviet states that have been some of the most advanced in terms of seeking diversification beyond Russia. We saw that in the case of Lithuania, when it tried to maintain a role in the export chain of Russian oil, for example. We certainly have seen that in Belarus. And perhaps most importantly for our discussion in March 2022, we have seen that so clearly with European Union states and firms. We have seen that through the way in which a whole array of Western European actors were drawn into the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 project. We have seen that through a whole array of profitable joint ventures with Russian energy. And again, to understand the importance of this, you need to look at the entire chain and not simply at high gloss, highly visible companies. And you have to understand the role of European Union firms in the export of energy technology to Russian companies. So that balance and that tension between threat and temptation has been really key for Ukraine, but also for other states. And in my view, is key for understanding why we got to where we are in February 2022. But I also want to flag something very important. Ukraine, even when it has been presented by so many as disposable in the energy transit, after all, the idea behind Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 was that it was much better to avoid Ukraine. Ukraine was and continues to be central for European energy, the European energy architecture. And I want all of us to just keep in our radar the historical background to the current situation, and in particular, the beginning of large-scale Soviet natural gas and oil exports to the European Union. My good colleague and member of my study group in Germany, the Swedish historian Per Högselius, wrote a wonderful book on this, Red Gas. And understanding that period is also going to be essential for understanding that threat and temptation interface, also, especially in the European Union states, but also Ukraine's centrality to that system, including the fact that some of the first natural gas exports were fed by production from Ukraine. So very briefly, what can we flag when we talk about threat and temptation in each of these types of energy? If we are talking about the case of natural gas, certainly we are thinking of threats in terms of supply cutoffs. We have seen that in 2006, 2009, but the element of temptation, also very strong, through corrupt gains, through arbitrage, through price differentials until 2010, through the very important issue of maintaining the load and the pressure in the Ukrainian grid so that it could function properly, something you cannot do if you don't have sufficient amounts of gas in the pipeline. And the idea of Ukraine's playing an important transit role as an implicit security guarantee, as triangulating the relationship between Ukraine, the European Union, and Russia in a way that would not happen would Ukraine be totally set aside from the natural gas transit role. And of course, a lot of the discussions about Nord Stream 2 and Nord Stream 1 had to do exactly with this, because had Russia managed to export most of its natural gas to Europe through Nord Stream 1 and 2, eschewing Ukraine, it would have meant an even bigger marginalization of Ukraine from European energy, from European security discourses as well. In the case of oil, we also see the interface between threat and temptation, with a larger role for the refining sector as an element, and transit fees as an element as well. Oil obviously is central to our discussion today, and the emphasis put on this book on the value chain and supply chain, again, is very important when we look at the way in which Western energy companies are acting vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia in this situation today. And in the case of coal, we see a very interesting situation where large-scale imports of one particular type of coal, coking coal, made possible and supported the tremendous expansion of Ukraine's role as a major steel exporter, which in turn supported the development of very important political groupings, in particular in Donetsk. And here this is a very good example of the use of energy, not simply as power over a state, but as power by particular actors to start to prop their political power domestically. We could have a separate conversation on coal. We have a wonderful colleague, Oleg Savitsky from Ukraine, who is an expert on this topic. Perhaps on another occasion, we could have a separate session on coal and Ukraine's future. For now, I just want to flag you that this is probably the most interesting chapter in the book. At least it was, for me, the most difficult to write as well. So what does all of this mean looking forward? And what does all of this mean in terms of how we look at the situation today? Well, first, we often look at Nord Stream. We often look at the Mariupol blockade, Mariupol being also in this book the hero of the coal and steel chapter. But we also need to understand how that threat and temptation, especially as it affected Western European players in these energy chains, really enabled Russia's war on Ukraine this year. The joint profits of EU companies working with Russia filled Russia's war chest. If I remember correctly, every day Russia is receiving $200 million from its natural gas exports to Western Europe, and there are many other sources of income. That joint interest in those Russian energy chains weakened the sanctions imposed in 2014 as a result of Russia's invasion and taking over of 7% of Ukrainian territory. It made it, most importantly, it made it very easy for these actors and very tempting to neglect Ukraine, to think about Ukraine as not reliable, to think about Ukraine as better left aside, as too complicated. And these are really important issues that we need to think about as we look looking forward. It also, though, that tension between threat and temptation also interface with a very unique situation in European Union policy, where you had basically two policies that were clashing in the early 2000s. The more long-standing policy of security of supply, trying to diversify energy supplies, but on the other hand, the wave of policies towards liberalization of economic interactions in the European Union, which is very good at one level, but on the other level meant that the European Union did not invest in very key infrastructure because it believed that this was best left to the market. And this is one reason why the European Union today cannot import sufficient amounts of liquefied natural gas to move away from Russian pipeline gas, for example. So you had a perfect storm between that temptation side of the chain and the conflict between different strands of European Union policy as well. And this is something I also discuss in the book. Finally, I simply want to flag that the European energy market, even before February 24th, was changing. The move towards decarbonization meant that actually the energy chains, the transit role that Ukraine had betted its future on, were going to become less and less important. And with the changes that have been solidified as a response to the Russian invasion, that move away from fossil fuels, that move away from the reliance on transit is going to be more and more important, calling for a question about what will Ukraine's role and desired role in this future be. It's extremely interesting to see that even today, the Ukrainian natural gas transit system is working. It's actually transiting more Russian natural gas than a month or two ago. Ukrainian engineers are working very hard to keep that transit going heroically, while at the same time, income from that trade is being used in the war against Ukraine. So again, the threat and temptation continue to be there even during the war. Let me leave it at that here. I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion with my wonderful colleagues. And if you're interested in these topics, you may want to follow me on Twitter, Balmaceda Energy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Margarita. I would like to ask if Andrian Prokip would like to respond first. Andrian is joining us from Lviv. So if you could give us a bit of a sense of your response to this book and also to Dr. Balmaceda's presentation.
Thank you. My great pleasure today to speak this webinar. First of all, I must say that that's really a great book, and it is a must read for all who are interested in European energy, in Russian and Ukrainian energy. So that's a really must read. In 2015, 2016, with Margarita, we had great discussions about energy and value chains. Margarita was working on this book, and I was finishing my book, which was on energy security. However, it was deeply theoretical. And among these, we were discussing an issue of energy power, energy blackmailing, and energy weapon. And I must say that many people in the past were very skeptical with the term of energy weapon and with this phenomena. And many were very skeptical that energy may be used as a part of aggressive campaigns. Here, I must say that the term of energy weapon, it was born in the United States. It was, for the first time, it was used by US General Taylor in 1874 in his article in Foreign Affairs. And he was talking about energy weapon, about Soviet energy weapon, which may be used by the communist system to undermine capitalist countries. So it's not something new, and it wasn't something created in Europe. So that was very interesting for me that some people in US were very skeptical about using this term, considering that it was developed by American military general when talking about Kremlin policy. So clear that energy dependency is bilateral. So on the one side, energy importing country is dependent on crucial energy imports, and on the other side, there is energy exporter, which is dependent on incomes. And Margarita's concept makes the scope of the problem wider. That's an expansion of analysis from just energy dependency. It's about value added behind this dependency, which actually makes this dependency more sophisticated and more interesting. Actually, the book and this approach explains what we may call a black box of energy dependency. When we had these great talks with Margarita, so we were thinking both that energy blackmailing and using as energy weapon cannot last too long, because in the case if one country is blackmailing other with energy, there should be a response. So, but there was one thing. So this means that other dependent country will try to eliminate this dependence. But there was one important thing that we missed in our analysis, because as normal people, we were thinking in the scale of normality, because we were thinking in a framework of a proper response to any threat in order to prevent occurring this threat in future or occurring bigger threats. But reality tend to be not normal. And I would just like to list a few historical points. So 2014, Crimea Annexation, beginning the war in Donbass, and sure, everyone in Europe was shocked, in US was shocked, and in late 2015, the project of South Stream pipeline was cancelled. There was a pipeline 63 BCM capacity, which had to go under the Black Sea and supply gas to European Union. So on December 1st, it was cancelled. In early 2015, there was an official document. It was called something like framework, strategical framework for European Energy Union. And it was given a hope about new policy of energy security in the European Union. They were saying that energy policy will be in view that they will continue cooperation with Russia only basing on reasonable factors, only if it's competitive, only if it's necessary, only if it's secure, and only if it's environmentally friendly. But what we saw later in September 2015, we saw a deal on Nord Stream 2 construction. Later, we saw Turkish Stream construction. We actually was a new version of the South Stream, just 2 times less, 31 BCM. But at final extent, we saw all these projects constructed. The fact what we saw that European Union didn't consider energy dependency as a threat, and Europe didn't notice how Russia was using its energy weapon. And now Germany is saying that it was stupid to become so deeply dependent on Russian energy supplies. There was a quotation of today's speech of German economy minister. So today Europe is, so when we had these talks with Margarita about energy dependency, we missed another one thing, because if some country or some union is so much deeply dependent on some supplier, it makes possibilities for this supplier to use energy as a weapon. Because today we see that European Union is so much dependent on Russia in energy supplies that it's almost impossible immediately to refuse from these supplies as a kind of response. For example, in the recent 2 or 3 years, share of Russian natural gas supplies to the European Union. So in some quarters, Russia was responsible for more than 15% of imports. And the volume of these supplies were in some quarters more than capacity of all LNG terminals installed in European Union. So now that is a big problem of the response for the European Union. Some countries are hesitating about exposing sanctions against energy sector, and that's very tricky in terms of response to Russia. So that what Margarita was saying, temptation, so dependency and temptation, which makes actually problems. The only thing I hope that Europe will not do the same mistake again, when in a year or 2 they will just forget about this. And one remark about gas transit. So Margarita mentioned this, that now Ukraine is transiting Russian gas to European Union in the volumes according to the contract, and that's really interesting question, because many people both in Ukraine and in other countries, they're curious if there is a war, why Ukraine didn't stop this transit, considering that Ukraine banned gas exports, even including the gas which was stored in Ukraine by other companies. That's a really good question. I suspect that that Ukraine is afraid that this will be considered by Europe as blackmailing, and I think that Russia is playing the game as well, because Russia do have enough capacities to bypass these volume of gas bypassing Ukraine. Maybe Russia is playing this game that, look, they won't do this business as usual. And I suspect that in Ukraine, in Kiev, there is a fear that if Ukraine suspends transit, despite the contract, it may be used to blame Ukraine in energy blackmail.
Thank you. Margarita, would you like to respond quickly?
I simply want to say that this is a very, very interesting element here of that triangular relationship. Maybe during the Q&A, we can go back to Andrian and to others to discuss this. Thank you, Andrian. Wonderful to see you.
Thank you. Thanks.
And thank you so much for your contributions to this book, because some of the concepts that that we discuss, after 5 p.m. at the Wilson Center, they are so central for this. Thank you.
Thanks, Margarita.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Andrian, and I would like to turn the floor over to Mr. Oleg Savitsky.
Thanks. It's really a great pleasure to be here today with you in this discussion, which is, I would say, very pivotal and historic in the context of what we really now encounter in Ukraine and in Europe in terms of Russian aggression. And I would say that this is a moment of truth, the moment when we finally encounter all the consequences of those power relations, of those Russian energy chains that were operational for many decades. So it's really a moment of truth when Europe and the world now see the real face of the Kremlin regime and the real consequences of fossil fuel addiction, because those energy chains, they were constructed with active participation of Western companies, Western governments. We know the role that Schroeder played in the construction of the Nord Stream 1, and the extent of relationships between Mr. Putin and Mr. Tillerson, the head of ExxonMobil. So I think we are actually now encountering all the consequences of fossil fuel infrastructure lock-in, which happened due to short-sightedness and obviously vested interests in Europe. And actually, this decade, the past decade was a critical time for diversification away from fossil fuels, but still huge amounts of money were still funneled in fossil fuel infrastructure. It's not only Nord Stream 1 or Nord Stream 2 or other gas pipelines. A lot of money was invested also in the coal power plants, which in Germany now run on Russian imported coal. So it's a really large phenomenon, and a phenomenon of irresponsibility and I would say misconduct in the energy policy, which was irresponsible both in environmental and security terms, and now we bear the costs of it, and Ukrainians bear the cost of it with their lives. We actually now a sacrifice zone, which was created due to Europe's fossil fuel addiction. So now, obviously, European Union has to do as much as possible to reverse this course of action as quickly as possible, and just to eliminate all investment and trade with Russian energy companies to eliminate dependence on Russian fossil fuels. And we see now a lot of interest in this topic among think tanks, analysts in Europe, and I was really fascinated with the analysis performed by Bruegel, a Brussels-based think tank, and they did a very extensive work in very short time, mapping oil and coal dependencies in Europe, and how they really can be eliminated in very short time if really a coordinated policy response is in place. So I think now we are in the moment when Russian energy chains can come to an end, and this should really be a pivotal moment for European energy policy and real shifts towards decarbonization. That can be a very high price to pay, but I hope that Europe can have a better future, both politically and in all other ways, without Russian fossil fuels.
Thank you so much, Oleg. I think it's interesting to call this a moment of truth in the energy sector, as well as it is obviously a moment of truth in the international security structure as well. So, Margarita, do you want to respond really quickly? I'm going to ask Professor Hausmann to speak next.
Tremendously important issues, including the issue of what will be the role of Ukraine in a decarbonized Europe, because Ukraine played a role in that transit, and it was essential to a larger strategy. So when we start reconstruction Ukraine, we will all, I mean, not we, but when the world starts to reconstruct Ukraine, that needs to be part of the strategy, both of the Ukrainian state and of Europe. And it will require rethinking of Ukrainian strategy as well. So thank you so much, Ole. Really interesting. Very, very key points.
Thank you. Professor Hausmann.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm certainly not an expert in Russia's energy chains at all, but thank you very much for inviting me to this event, and above all to the author of this wonderful book, Margarita, to have the opportunity to share some thoughts with you about your recent book. I admire your proactivity and your ability to address such an important topic in your recent book. I think there's no doubt that this is a very timely publication, particularly for the German reader, as Germany figures prominently in this book. While reading the book, I noticed that Margarita shares many concern and interests with historians, although her book does not address the field explicitly. So she's a professor of international relations, and her focus is on the 3 recent years between 2011 and 2014, with references to developments, and I quote her, in cultural theory, anthropology, sociology, and geography, end of quote. So not to history. But I would like to single out some of the historical concerns here. And first is that Margarita engages critically with the previous literature on energy relations, which highlights Russia's state energy power in terms of a way that the author considers a traditional approach to the subject. And she has done this in her statement a few minutes ago. Again, instead she proposes to explore quote, the value and supply chains, that means the entire process from the discovery of an energy commodity to its delivery to final consumers, end of quote. So the perspective she proposes is a turn to practices. in contrast to the mere study of ideological statements, towards the analysis of agency or actors, a turn from the question of why to the question of how. And this interest in practices is something that historians certainly share with Margarita. And we also look to the developments in cultural theory, anthropology, sociology, and geography. And her book encourages us to further move along this line when exploring historical topics. Second, her book is situated at the intersection of the study of infrastructures, in particular pipelines and railways, and commodities. And both topics have recently found increased interest among historians as well. Economic history has been marginalized in the past decades in our discipline at the expense of cultural history. What we are witnessing in the past years is a certain return of subjects in economic history, and in particularly an interest in infrastructure and commodities, addressed in a more open or creative way than, for instance, in quantitative studies. In this regard, Margarita opens many new perspectives for us. She reminds us that modern infrastructures are not only complex structures, they are also enduring structures. They are built as if for eternity and can't be replaced immediately. A showcase in Margarita's book is the Soviet legacy of pipeline building. For instance, from northern Siberia through Ukraine, Slovakia, Czechia to Germany. One could go further back to the 18th and 19th centuries when such ideas were already flourishing. Namely, to link Russia's natural resources to Western European technology by various forms of infrastructures. And infrastructures they form spaces and spatial orientations. And in this regard, too, Margarita encourages us to pursue this spatial approach in historical studies. So that's my second point, and I have a third point. And I think I should address the third point because third and last, Germany figures prominently in her book as a consumer country of Russia's natural gas, crude oil and coal, or let's say diesel and steel. The last weeks, Russia's war against Ukraine have highlighted Germany's unhappy or very questionable role in this regard in many ways. The current dependence on Russia's gas, oil and coal, which has increased so dramatically in the last decades, thanks to the policy under Schröder and Merkel. Germany's interest and wishful thinking in the political integration of Russia by trade relations, and a very national and anti-European, and I would say also including anti-Ukrainian position of the country in this regard. So of Germany in this regard. German-Russian relations have, of course, not begun in late Soviet times. They reach back deeper in the past, and ideas about special economic relations between Germany and Russia go back at least to the early 20th century, I would say. So we have Siemens in Russia and all these kind of, economic relations going on for more than 100 years. And in her book, Margarita offers detailed insights in these relations, which did not just span great European powers, but also other stakeholders like Ukraine, Slovakia, and Czechia. It is a complex and important story, she tells us. So coming to an end, my brief remarks. Her book is, I think, of much interest for the European as the American reader, for historians as well as for colleagues from other disciplines and politicians, I would say, as well. So congratulations, Margarita, and good luck with your book. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Hausmann. Margarita, if you'd like to just say a couple words.
Extremely interesting insights, especially about that larger arc of history, giving sense to this, and only a historian with that larger perspective as you can see this. For example, that continuity of the idea of a special economic relationship between Russia and Germany, that is really interesting and important. And I had a little bit of glimpse through this, through my relationship with the Krupp Foundation, where I was a fellow in Greifswald, in the oil sector in the 1940s. But I think it would be so useful to think about those larger arcs of history at play here. So I'm very much looking forward to continuing this discussion in other settings as well. Thank you, Dieter.
Thank you so much. Okay, and I'd like to turn the floor over now to Professor Stephen Siegel.
Thank you, Markian, and congratulations, Margarita. And I really hope that everyone begins to follow her work on Twitter. I myself have been a great admirer of Professor Balmaceda's scholarship for over 20 years, starting from my days at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute and the Davis Center. So my first word is a word of congratulations. I hope people will read your other books too. And I think if we're going to talk about diversification of energy, especially as I'm coming from Texas, that there should be a second edition to this book, which you should begin writing right now, in addition to speaking about the other forms of energy, which I hope I can ask you a little bit about, maybe about the renewables and other things. So political scientists in general, I think, and I speak about this as a historian and a critical geographer, are often not the best people to ask about their positionality. But I think Professor Balmaceda is very good at this. And in terms of investigation, the language, the words that she uses and then begins to challenge are words that are obviously political footballs. They're very laden. And what she does, I think, in the book is get to the heart of things that go very easily out on Twitter without explanation. So some of these words I would say are dependency, corruption, and weaponization. Those are probably the big three. And in terms of my position here in Texas, at the University of Texas at Austin, I live in a state in the United States of America with 310 to 320 million people. The state of Texas is still very much fossil fuel dependent. And I take Professor Savitsky's point about sacrifice zone very seriously, having been a reader of Kate Brown, and I think we should talk about that. But the Texas economy still remains to this day 47% natural gas, 20% coal, 20% wind, 11% nuclear, 1% solar, and then 0.2% hydro, and whatever the rest is, I'm not really sure about. But that's how the 100% pie grid breaks down at the molecular level in terms of physical energy units. So it's kind of clear to me that Ukraine has itself been turned into a pipeline space, maybe even a sacrifice zone over the course of the last 20 years as we lurch from crisis to crisis. And I think we can even be stronger in our language now that the Kremlin has begun a war led by Mr. Putin as a war of aggression on February 24th, and speak about issues of collaboration. I think we should be stronger about that. And in terms of war crimes, I think that business leaders should be held accountable for their decisions, and that includes Mr. Schroeder. So let's not pretend to be neutral. I think we should actually begin being more forthright in the language and words that we choose. Now, I want to come to Professor Balmaceda's arguments, and I am very impressed by the managing pressure chapter. I think this is actually, in many ways, the best chapter of the book. I will say she sent me the book before February 24th, and I read it, and I listened to Natalia Shpilova-Said's podcast, and then I read it again after the war had started, and I began to wonder about the structural tensions and structural crises, starting with EU policies. So I find very convincing in the book the history aspect that Guido Hausmann just talked about. I think that this is an excellent socioeconomic and sociopolitical history from the bottom up, looking at the dynamics of local intelligentsias and actors. My problem, however, with this is that local intelligentsia, if you will, or national intelligentsia actors have been supplanted and subsumed by business elites. And those elites are, I think, as anyone knows, working in the consulting world, very self-serving. So if we're talking about the structural crises in the corporate world, the security of supply going all the way back to OPEC and the oil crisis in 1973, the policies of liberalization of the 2000s, which of course coincide with the Putin regime, and the push toward decarbonization in the 2010s. These are unresolved tensions. And of course, what the EU has been doing is, in my opinion, very humbly, too little, too late. So too little, too late, I think, is another forceful way of saying, contra Timothy Snyder and intellectuals who are sitting in Vienna, that the EU is actually not representing some sort of higher moral value system. If you look very carefully at many of the things that it has been doing investigatively, and I love the Lithuanian intelligence documents in Margarita's book, and the concentration on Slovakia as well, and some of the Baltic countries, I think there are cover-ups in place. And I wonder, or would wonder, what some of those would be. And this is not getting into conspiracy, but this is actually thinking very much, knowing Professor Balmaceda's scholarship, of how she narrates convincingly these perfect storms, how things begin to come together. Now, I want to say, and really this is kind of a question because I don't want to take up all the time, but the period of investigation here now strikes me as almost like a golden age. And I don't know if this is a misinterpretation, but it is from beginning to end, October of 2011 to the Crimea annexation in March of 2014. This is a period of relative stability for price fluctuations. I would think, and maybe Margarita, you could correct me if I'm wrong about that. But the structural issues I would really like to see kind of explained in the larger context of climate change. So the Paris agreements, which took a very long time to try and implement from 2015 to 2016. In fact, November 4th, if I remember correctly, 2016 was the date they were finally implemented, and it coincided very well with the Trump election, which of course is a catastrophe, in my view, not just a catastrophe, but really a big historical event with all relationships between Trump and Putin and so forth. So I would kind of ask Professor Balmaceda to maybe shift a little bit. This is almost beyond the scope of the book, history, geography, and futurology, to speaking about the possibilities for renewable energy in the context of climate change, because the disaster of this war has been to transform Ukraine into rubble. This is what makes me so catastrophically sad, Because when the EU now makes these gestures to give millions, billions of dollars to Ukrainians, having the whole pipeline project been put on hold, Nord Stream 2, I wonder who the stakeholders now might be. And this leads me to my final point, which is again taking my stupid Texas perspective on geopolitics. The questions that I get from Texas Republicans are very different than the questions I get from Texas Democrats in the year 2022, moving up to the US election in 2024. The questions I get from Texas Democrats are, with big hearts, humanitarians, how can we help Ukrainians? Because the whole world really, I think at this moment, is not persuaded by any of the Kremlin's lies, pretexts, or turns to fascism. Yet, the Texas Republicans are still interested in profit, and they're still interested in fossil fuels and oil markets. And to give one final example of how things have changed, on March 6th, Axios reported that the United States was having negotiations with both Venezuela, President Maduro, and Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince bin Salman. So I don't know what this actually now means in the world of geopolitics beyond the scope of what we're looking at. Slovakia, Ukraine, Hungary, EU countries. I think the alliance system has been transformed so significantly. And down my street, actually a couple of kilometers away, is Elon Musk, who has made ridiculous comments on Twitter, about the again, in my humble opinion, about the safety of nuclear energy. He's talking about high radiation and eating locally and all these sorts of things to make Europe more dependent on nuclear power. And he actually thinks in many ways, with all of his projects to privatize electricity in Texas, that he's going to be able to do this with the grid in the EU. Now, I don't know how this will affect Ukraine at all, but my prediction, would be that the futurologists are now involved moving forward. And that's actually a pretty dangerous thing because they don't know what they're doing. And they don't quite have Professor Balmaceda's knowledge going back 30 years to try and sort of predict how one can get the EU, not to mention the United States, more dependent on renewable energy. So it's the end of my comments. I really congratulate you on the book. There are so many strengths here. I will go back and I will read the part of Nord Stream 2 when I'm a lot less angry at the Germans and Euro-Atlantic Alliance. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Siegel, Stephen. There's a couple more. I just want to say one thing for people who are interested in purchasing the book. It's available from Columbia University Press, and you can use the code CUP20 at checkout for a 20% discount. Please see the Shevchenko website for links to that. And I would like to now, since we have about 20 minutes left, I want to open up the floor to questions from the audience. So please use the Q&A function that you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And while we're doing that, I wondered if Margarita might respond to some of the points that Stephen Siegel made.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Stephen, for giving a context that is even broader than what I was expecting. The need to reconceptualize these relationships in the context of the need for decarbonization is really a key issue. And I have to confess that I came to the importance of decarbonization pretty late, only about 5 years ago, and it's not even totally reflected in this book. When this war ends, Ukraine will need to rethink its role in a world that will need to have moved much more clearly towards decarbonization. And that implies changes in every single of these chains that we have been discussing. So it's going to be an important challenge. It's also an important challenge because it forces us to rethink what are the natural resources that Ukraine can use in this new stage. I have a lot of questions about this, and it's something that actually I suggest we should start thinking about now. We need to start thinking about reconstruction now. We have to start thinking about movement away from the coal-based economy. This is something that in July of 2021, Germany and the United States pledged to support Ukraine in as a consolation prize for giving the green light to Nord Stream 2. We'll need that once there will be a need for construction. The city of Mariupol is the hero of my coal chapter. Hero in a complex way, because this was a very politically and economically unsustainable system, also ecologically unsustainable. That city is being destroyed on our eyes. What kind of metallurgical industry will Ukraine rebuild? Will it be an attempt to rebuild a metallurgical industry based actually on being the only country in the world still using the 19th century technology that is in the museum elsewhere in the world? Or it will be a rebuilding based on hydrogen-based, non-carbon metallurgy, or maybe there will be no place for metallurgy. So these are all very serious questions, and we need to start thinking about them now. We have very good brains in Ukraine to think about this, including Mr. Savitsky, and I think we need to start preparing for this already now. So let's see if we have some questions.
I also want to allow the discussants to ask more questions, both of Margarita and of one another, if there is something that is relevant that's popped into your head. Yeah, Stephen Siegel.
Could you talk about Gazprom, please? I would really like to know how Gazprom features in your book, and maybe for our audience, if you could tell us a bit more about the relationship that you have found in Gazprom between, let's say, the moment of supply and, as you say, the value added supply chain. So I like how you introduce this intermediate stage for the refinery and things like that when you're talking about different forms of energy. But please talk about Gazprom. Can you give us a little bit of a background to that?
I think Gazprom is really interesting because obviously it's the major supplier, the company that still basically is controlling not only the production, but also the supply and the transit of natural gas through Nord Stream 1, for example. And even when it does not own the Ukrainian transit system, it largely determined the rules of the game. Gazprom is also the successor of the Soviet Ministry of Natural Gas Exports, which basically, with the beginning of large-scale exports, co-created not only the infrastructure that is the key infrastructure in Europe now, but also the contractual system. Co-created two generations of technical elites that saw themselves as bound by technological achievement, by so-called overcoming of the Iron Curtain. So it's a role that is much more foundational in a historical term. But also Gazprom is very interesting because in Gazprom we see a combination of state interests, the use of Gazprom as an instrument by the Russian state, but also Gazprom's own corporate interests and the corrupt interests of some Gazprom managers as well. And all of these kind of interfaces in that relationship. Also, we saw, especially until 2010, a very interesting relationship between Gazprom and Gazprom created intermediary companies that also played for about 10, 15 years a very important role in Ukraine's energy supply. Intermediary companies, which were basically the main suppliers of corruption gain. So it's a multifaceted role. And obviously, what is perhaps most important for our discussion concerning the situation today, Gazprom managed to create a very wide network of supporters in Europe. Not only corrupt politicians, but sports fans, common citizens who believed and saw that Gazprom's natural gas was the cleanest. So these are all very important elements of that role, and it's a very multifaceted role, having to do partially with its role as an instrument of the state, but also personal interests and corporate interests.
Great, thank you so much. I'd like to just highlight one of the questions that's come up in the Q&A from Jeff in Alberta. So Jeff writes that Alberta is like Texas, it's a center of oil production, and the premier of Alberta has seen the war as an opportunity for Alberta oil. So I was wondering if Margarita and maybe other panelists had thoughts on how the North American oil, gas, and coal is implicated in the networks that are described in the book, both historically and in the future.
Yes, absolutely. This is very important. And for example, when we think about the sanctions that Russia has been subjected to now, hopefully these are much more serious sanctions than the wishy-washy sanctions of 2014, and I think they are. But it's really important to be vigilant, because a lot of those ties are not simply ties in terms of direct investment. For example, Mr. Savitsky mentioned the role of the very important relationship between Mr. Tillerman and Mr. Putin, and that is very very important. But we also have a whole another set of companies, many of them located in Alberta, in Texas, that provide technical services to the Russian oil industry. Russia's oil and natural gas production faces a reality that a lot of its fields are aging fields, mature fields, brown fields. The only way it can produce anything from these fields is to have access to certain types of technology. The only way it can have access to the new fields, the white fields, the Arctic fields, is through special technology. It cannot produce that technology. It depends on Western technology for this. And here you see all those other players coming to the surface. I am not an expert on the names of each of them, but I think this is something that those of us, or those of you who have a unique connection with important oil states like Texas and Alberta, to be vigilant and to think about how these companies may be continuing to play a role here.
Great. Anyone else on that question? There's this question of technological transfer, obviously, that Russian extraction industries are dependent on.
Guido has a question.
Hausman?
Yes.
No, I just would like to add just 2-3 sentences on the question of America's role in all this. So just be in mind that there are anti-American sentiments in German society, which were kind of very apparent, became during the Euromaidan in 2013-14. So in the past weeks. But much of the pro-Russian leanings or policies, well, not policies, but pro-Russian sentiments, they are more anti-American sentiments, in fact. So this plays a role in our, and also in the current discussion on liquid gas from the US to Germany. You know, there are plans now to build a liquid gas port in northern Germany. So this of course plays a role. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Oleg or Andrian? Oleg, did you raise your hand there?
Yeah, I would like to also reflect on the technological transfer and the technological ties between Rosneft, Gazprom, and other Russian companies with Western companies, which obviously provided the necessary technology to expand the production. And we remember the crazy projects to expand the production to Arctic regions, and obviously the embargo on Russian oil adopted by the US should be also very closely monitored by the civil society and analysts, and to see that really no investment or no forms of cooperation happen between Russian and US based fossil fuel companies. If this link can be really broken, that obviously will make large amounts of Russian fossil fuels unrecoverable, and that would be a huge service to climate change mitigation on the supply side, and it will decrease the pressure on the planet's carbon budget. So if we can eliminate part of the fossil fuel reserves from the account books, and this will obviously also reduce the market valuation of Russian energy companies, and it's really a very important area to look into. Thanks.
Great. That's a really great point. Why don't we bring in Andrian and then Stephen?
Yeah, just a small short remark regarding continuing that what Oleg said about and decarbonization and Russian energy companies and Europe and global problems. Because Russian energy companies, mostly Gazprom and Rosneft, sure they understood the challenge of decarbonization, and they wanted to be a part of European energy business even after decarbonization was speeding up. However, sure, I believe that Russians try to undermine, well, not undermine, but slow down European energy transition, and that what we saw last year with energy markets. Actually, well, there was nothing new because the situation was very similar. That was in 2011 when there was very similar energy crisis in Europe, however, much shorter, and gas prices spike was much less. So, and then Russians were persuading the European Union, saying that it was these were renewables whom they had to blame because of price hike, and also Russians tried to persuade the European Union to sign more long-term contracts rather than a spot trade, rather than market trade. So that what happened last year was nothing new, but the scale was much bigger. And again, they were talking about role of renewables, and again they were calling Europeans to sign long-term deal. But regarding decarbonization, so sure, Russians were understanding that they were not ready, they were not prepared for decarbonization so quickly, so they wanted to postpone because Russians were they had plans to still have plans to export hydrogen to the European Union, to Europe. But they were also persuading that they can export natural gas, and then in Germany or somewhere else, this natural gas may be diffracted to hydrogen. And however, that was a problem. What should be done with carbon? And so Rosneft and Russia in general. So Rosneft now is very big player in feeding forests to capture CO2, and Russians they have a plan so that Russia became the biggest global player in using forests for CO2 capturing. So we never can trust Russians, because you never know if the data they present is true. That's why Europeans would never trust in carbon capture storage capacities in Russia. But I guess that forest factor might be well. In past they planned to use this, but now that's still a chance how Russia will try to play the card of using forests and in carbon capture. Sure, if you have millions of hectares fires in Siberia, it's easy to plant new trees, or just tell that you are planting trees to capture CO2. But still, that is so. When talking about sanctions, when talking about technology dependence that Russia has, they may try to play this card, talking about importance of climate change prevention and energy transition. So that is the card they may try to use in the nearest future.
I'd like to give Oleg a chance to just speak very, very quickly because we're running out of time here, and I would like to get one more question.
I will try to reflect very briefly. So Russia's allegations on any kind of climate policy, they are just ridiculous, because they even unable to prevent huge gas leaks from their pipelines, which are seen from satellites. And this mega forest is just a bluff. It's really just a window dressing and nothing more. It has no real material background in it. It's just storytelling.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'd like to ask the one more question from the Q&A, and this question comes from George Grobovich. And there's also another question in the chat about the centrality of oil and gas to global decision-making powers. And I think it's clear that it's very central to Russian decision-making. But I'd like to just ask about what kinds of responses that we've had from the West, because Professor Siegel, and this is Professor Grobovich's question, Steve mentioned very correctly the attendant issues of corruption and collaboration when speaking about the marketing and weaponization of fossil fuels by Russia. Can anyone comment on this and tell us what the progress has occurred and where we can look for progress reports? How do we track the kinds of things that have been going on? And I think I'd like to give Margarita the final word here.
I'm not sure what mechanisms have been built to track the latest decisions. What the most important decision we have seen, in addition to our own decision to embargo, our own US decision to embargo Russian oil imports, is the European Union decision 9 days ago in Versailles to drastically reduce the importation of Russian fossil fuels, in particular to reduce the importation of Russian natural gas by 2/3 by the end of this year, in part by bumping up the speed of decarbonization. So amazingly, 1 month ago, it seems that it was not possible, and now suddenly it is possible when you want it to be possible. I imagine there might be some of the environmental NGOs that are tracking this, but maybe Ole Savitsky knows more about this or could share that with us. I am not aware, but I think it would be very important to have one particular watchdog checking on this, because again, there's a lot of levels and there's a lot of ways in which those sanctions and that move away from Russian fossil fuels may be dodged, including to third countries and through India and China. I do not have the answer about what that watchdog is, but I will certainly look for it.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time, and Margarita Balmaceda and I have to jump over to another panel discussion on energy security. But I would like to thank Margarita Balmaceda for appearing with us today for Shevchenko Scientific Society, and to all of our panelists, Andrian Prokip, Oleg Savitsky, Guido Hausmann, and Steven Siegel, and all of you for sticking around with us and talking about this important thing. I'd like to also mention next week, we will have another Shevchenko Scientific Society webinar, this time with Alexander Motel, who will be discussing and reading from his Pitun trilogy. This is 3 books: The Jew Who Was Ukrainian, Vovochka, and Pitun's Last Stand. So join us next week for that. That will be at noon on Saturday, March 26th. And thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Margarita. Congrats.
You're welcome. I will follow up with all of you personally.